International Association. Welcome everybody to the seminar of the International Association for Research in Economic Psychology and the Journal of Economic Psychology. Today it's our pleasure to have Carsten Dreu with us, who is a renowned expert and well-known expert on cooperation, intergroup conflict, decision neuroscience, and so on. And who is also right now, together with Eric van Dijk, guest editor of a special issue of the journal on social institution failure and how it can fail to foster cooperation sometimes. And as I understand it, the deadline has still not passed, so you can still consider submitting to that issue after being motivated by today's talk. Carsten Dreu has an impressive CV. It would take me a very long time to talk about it, so I will not. Suffice to say, he has an H index of 111, which is a funny number, but also an impressive one, and over 60,000 citations at last count. So Carsten, the floor is yours. This is supposed to take like an hour. We will monitor the questions and ask people to step in whenever a question is asked, if that is okay with you, and you can take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here, and I'm much looking forward to the exchange. So I have a number of slides that I will go through that support my talk. Indeed, if there are very pressing questions for clarification, then please somehow identify, and I'll try to address them. More broader questions, I think we can hold for the end, and I'm happy to stay as long as possible for answering them. Okay, so my talk today is about carrying capacity, stress, parochialism, and intergroup conflict. And essentially, what I'm going to do is present a series of experiments that are part of the ERC advanced project that I have been supervising over the last 5 or 6 years. So I take a few of the nicer studies, I think, out of them, and also including some of the work that is still in progress. So therefore, also, I'd be highly interested in your feedback, either after the talk or in some other ways. So the basic question that we start with is the following. If my keyboard now works, there we are. So here you see 3 images, and on the left one you see the globe, and on the globe there are certain so-called hotspots, areas where, according to the International Climate Research Program, the ICCP in 2017. These are areas where the natural environment is really deteriorating as a result of climate change. And they assume that in those areas, there might also be more migration flows, displacements of people, famine, but also conflict and violence among groups of people. And some evidence for that you see in the middle panel, which is a snapshot of a study by Burke and colleagues and summarized in a meta-analysis they published a few years later in Science. Where you see basically that if temperature anomalies go up, so it becomes warmer than average, what you also see then is that, at least in East Africa, where they performed these studies, there is an increased incidence of intergroup conflicts, political violence, and so on and so forth, and a pretty steep and impressive result, also an unfortunate result, of course. And then finally, to the right, you see an image of a forecasting study of an expert panel that was published a few years back in Nature, where they basically, on the assessments of expertise, research, anecdotal evidence, and so on and so forth, came to the conclusion that with increase in temperature across the globe, there will be also an increase in incidence of conflict between groups of people. Now, all that is very impressive and also very problematic, of course, and at the same time, it is very macro level, and we really lack a deep understanding of the micro foundations. How can these environmental pressures induced by climate change, for example, create intergroup conflicts between groups of people? That's the basic question that I'm going to ask for today. And I will show you a series of experiments in which we unravel the potential steps from environmental pressures all the way to intergroup conflict and back. So as an overarching framework, this is how we tend to think about conflict, which in the middle has it, intergroup conflict, that you can identify or decompose in terms of the initiation of conflict, where one group aggresses another group that has to defend itself against that aggression. Then escalation of conflict, where both groups increasingly use elevated levels of effort or violence, if you want. And then at some point, there is some sort of settlement where one group wins over the other, subordinates it, or there is some kind of compromise or negotiated agreement. This has all kinds of conflict payoffs that will not be that important for today's talk. What is more important is the mechanisms that we think produce intergroup conflict, that lead to the initiation and escalation of intergroup conflict. And roughly, if you look at the literature in the social behavioral sciences, these mechanisms boil down to two things. One is individual states and traits, like antisocial personalities, for example, or perhaps pro-social personalities, competitiveness amongst people, and so on and so forth. Incentives, if you want, to fight, spoils of war that can up your status in the group. But also what we would call parochialism. And parochialism is more of a group level situation where individuals within the group cooperate with each other within the group and shy away from or even exclude outsiders, strangers, outgroup members from cooperative exchange. Parochialism sometimes can even become violent towards outgroups in order to protect the in-group against outgroup aggression. I will come back to that later. Now, the question that we could ask then is, how can environmental pressures trigger or put in motion these mechanisms that thereby then create intergroup conflict? So that's basically how we can think about it. Now, behind all this is a bit of theory, I would say, and I'll quickly walk you through. The idea is that environmental pressures can create so-called carrying capacity stress. And carrying capacity stress basically means that the supply of resources a group needs to survive and function or to thrive falls short of what the group actually needs. So if there is less resources available than what a group needs, a group would experience carrying capacity stress. Now, this unfortunate situation where the influx of resources is below what a group needs can be the result of deteriorating habitats or cuts in the supply of resources through environmental shocks, for example. But it can also be from an internal dynamic where a group grows, becomes very healthy, expands, with more mouth to feed. But if there is no more resources available, then also there will be carrying capacity stress. So there can be many reasons why this carrying capacity stress emerges, one being deteriorating habitats. Now, if we think from this perspective, what carrying capacity stress could do to groups of people, the literature suggests a number of possibilities. The first one is that under carrying capacity stress or environmental shocks, people within group are more binded together. You can think about safety in numbers. We can help each other perhaps better to deal with the outside threats. There is a sense of common fate. There's a beautiful study, for example, several years ago, published in PLOS ONE, where they investigated groups of people that were exposed to earthquakes. And these environmental shocks, really threatening to groups, created stronger within-group cohesion, stronger tendencies to help each other, and to self-sacrifice for the benefit of each other. So one effect of carrying capacity stress may actually be that groups become more pro-social within. And there's an increased solidarity and also an increase in parochialism, greater cooperation within your own group than between and with people or groups outside. Now, the third mechanism that may operate here, the third effect, is that external threats to your own self-interests, if you want, can make the risk of fighting comparatively less aversive. So fighting is risky. You get injured, you may even die. But if the external environment becomes so pressing that you may get injured or die, then basically the relative risk of fighting changes in favor of fighting and away from not fighting. And finally, the spoils of war that a group can get from winning conflict with another group may actually reduce the carrying capacity stress. Simply, you gain resources from another group, you can use them to feed the mouth within your own group. So these are the possible effects of carrying capacity stress that we can identify from the literature. And in each of these cases, the evidence, I would say, is limited, anecdotal, and one of the goal, and never tied together. And that's basically what we are going to do in the experiments that I will talk you through. So here is a quick summary of the pathway, basically, from environmental pressures and carrying capacity stress to parochialism to intergroup conflict, but also direct links from environmental pressures to intergroup conflict. And finally, there could be also links back. That's the spoils of war that could relax the environmental pressures. Each of these four numbers here will be part of experimental studies that I'm going to show you. So in the first set of experiments, we looked at public good provision games. So there's no outgroup here. We simply look at how much individuals within a group contribute to a public good. These are 3-person groups, and they make contributions across 10 trials. On each trial, they have an endowment, invest, they get a return from the public good, and then they get a reset. They get feedback on what the returns are and how much everybody earns. Then there's a reset, and this goes on for 10 rounds. Now we have 3 treatments in this particular study. In the above treatment, people are hooked up to a little device on their finger, and they get electric shocks. And these are painful shocks. These shocks also become unpredictable. They don't know when it comes. It comes always before an investment trial, but whether it comes or not is not entirely clear. But if they come to all the 3 group members at the same time, and all of the 3 group members have identified in a pilot testing that these are pretty painful, sustainable, but painful shocks. So you don't want that. This is our manipulation of external threat in this particular case. We have 2 control treatments. In the green one, people are not hooked up to any device. That is a completely safe environment. In the orange one, they are hooked up to the device, but they do not get a painful shock. They get a very light tinkling on their finger. So that's not painful. So there is something happening. So this is basically, you're in the exact physiological setup, if you want, as the threat of shock, but you don't experience any pain or displeasure. So we have 3 treatments, and we are going to compare the red treatment, the environmental threat, against the orange and green. Now, first, we look at physiological stress. Throughout the public goods provision game, we measure the amount of stress, physiological stress, by looking at 2 things, heart rate and skin conductance. Here you see skin conductance. It's an important measure of anticipatory threat at the physiological level. And what you see is that across these trials, people in the red condition, when there is a painful shock that they may get from time to time, experience higher levels of skin conductance that is more physiological threat than those in the 2 control conditions, who do not differ from each other. So that's some first evidence that our manipulation of external threat indeed is physiologically stressful to people. Now then we look also at what happens with contributions to the public goods game. And this you see here. Let's first look at the 2 control treatments, the yellow and the green bars. What we see there is a typical effect of public good provision over time, where we see that groups start relatively high, and then over time, due to the temptation to free ride on others, cooperation breaks down from, in this particular case, around 6 out of 10 units to roughly 5 out of 10 units. This does not happen. This breakdown of cooperation does not happen in the threat treatment. In the red bar remains relatively stable over time, and the endpoint does not significantly differ from the beginning point. And this shows to us some first evidence for this idea that external threat can bind people, can make people more cooperative, or at least less willing to free ride on each other and exploit each other. And as a result of that, groups under threat are better able to maintain public goods provision and cooperation better than those in more safe environments. So that's some first evidence for the idea that environmental stresses can actually make groups within more cooperative, or as I called it earlier, parochial. Now, in the next step, we are going to look at two other components, and that is whether parochialism, as we have seen that in the first study, this in-group cooperation, can actually give rise to between-group conflict and how that might work. And in the first study, we used an intergroup attacker-defender contest game. And in this contest game, this goes as follows. We have 6 people coming to the lab. We randomly assign them to 2 groups of 3. One group we call now here the attacker, and the other group we call here the defender. In reality, we use completely neutral labels. Each individual in each of these 2 groups gets an endowment, let's say 20 monetary units, that they can use to keep and take home. It's worth money. Or they can invest some of it or all of it in a public good. Let's call that their group's fighting capacity. We have 2 types of fighting capacities, an attack capacity shown here in red and a defense capacity shown here in blue. So those 3 people in the attacker group can invest in their attack capacity. Those in the defender group can invest in their defense capacity. Whatever they invest is wasted, is lost. They do not get it back. So in principle, you would expect them not to invest in either attack or defense. However, the rule of the game is such that if the attack capacity is higher, larger than the defense capacity, the attacker group wins everything that the defenders did not invest. So to give you a very basic example, suppose one person in the attacker group invests 1 out of his 20 units, and no one on the defender side invests anything in defense. Then we have the rule 1 in the attacker pot, 0 in the defender pot. The attacker wins and earns everything that the defenders did not invest, which is 3 times 20 in the keep. And this all goes to the attacker. That almost doubles their original endowment of 20. So it can be very attractive for attackers to invest a little bit, knowing that defenders will invest a little bit more, knowing that attackers may invest a little bit more, and so on and so forth. Game theoretically, we can do the equilibrium analyses. I will show you what the point estimates for this game would be later on. But it's a pretty dynamic game with mixed strategy equilibria. And we see that people do invest, oftentimes over-invest, and that this is a pretty dynamic conflict game over time. I hope I explained it well. In the rest of my talk, I will primarily look at the attackers, what they do. And the reason is that attackers basically initiate, they are in the driver's seat. Once they start to invest, defenders become fearful and need to invest back. So attackers here are really initiating and escalating the conflict. Defenders are typically following what the attackers are doing and have been doing on previous rounds of the interaction. Now, in this particular study, we created 2 treatments. One treatment was where everybody was just assigned randomly to 2 groups, and they were sitting there in their own clothes. I hope the picture is not too daunting. I will walk you through. So in one setting, they were just in their own clothes, and they were not allowed to talk prior to the game. And the other treatment, which I call the bonding treatment, or the parochial treatment, the individuals are asked to put on a white t-shirt in one group, the attacker group in white, and the defender group in black, or the other way around. But they, within a group, they were now all in the same clothes. And prior to the game, they were able to talk briefly for about 3 minutes over the chat function of their computers about some personal things, trying to find stuff that they had in common, like food preferences or a holiday destination, very briefly. So these were slightly more bonded, slightly more known to each other. So we have two treatments, a random, basic, minimal group setup, and a more of a, we got to know each other a little bit, bonding situation. We also hooked these people on an FNIR system, which basically allowed us to track online during the decision-making brain potentials, both within what happens within one's brain, but we could also see to what extent are the people within one group synchronizing in their brain signals. Now that's super interesting, but I will not go into too much depth here. We see two things, however. First, as expected, when we increase this parochialism through a bonding manipulation, we see that these groups invest more in attack than they invest in the low parochialism or the minimal group treatment. So a simple intervention in making groups a little bit more bonded makes them also more aggressive as attackers. One reason for this could be that they don't want to free ride on each other. They want to chip in. They want to be a good fellow, good for the group. Their task is to perhaps fight. Let's fight. And I don't want to be less strong or less more of a free rider than others are in the group. The second thing you see on the right-hand side is that in the bonding groups, we see stronger what we call neural synchronization. That is, in the prefrontal cortex, where the decisions are being made and risk assessments are taking place, we see that there is the brain potentials within one individual start to correlate very strongly with those of the other two individuals in the group. And this correlates strongly with the tendency to attack. So this is a very basic, but also very neural measure of parochialism, of bonding, that actually then is related also to the degree to which they invest in attacking the other group. So again, this has nothing to do with environmental pressures, but it does show how increasing the bonding within a group increases parochialism, also hostility towards an outgroup, and that possibly this is mediated by brain-to-brain synchronization that is also stronger under this bonding when you wear the same t-shirts. Now, the third step is to ask whether environmental pressures can lead to intergroup conflict through parochialism or perhaps outside of parochialism because of more selfish reasons, spoils of war as a possibility. We used again the attacker-defender contest game. In this particular case, we manipulated, however, what would happen to the money that people did not invest. Remember that everything you invest in fighting capacity is wasted and can only generate returns when your group is successful. In this particular study, we have one baseline treatment in which whatever you keep is for you to take home. That's for sure. In another treatment, this whatever you kept is subject to a risk of destruction, as we would call it. There's a 0.4 probability that whatever you kept is wasted, is taken away, is destroyed. Now you can think about this as a farmer who is always subject to some environmental risk. He sows, but whether the harvest comes and yields is always a bit uncertain. Right? So this is the environmental uncertainty that we try to manipulate here in this very abstract basic thing. Now, if you do this, it becomes for people more attractive to invest their money in fighting than to keep it compared to a baseline situation. So the expected value of fighting increases here. So it has a bit of effect. The equilibrium of the game doesn't change, but the expected value, so the overall level of investment in conflict should go up in this particular tree. We control for that. So in the first set of results, we see that when we manipulate this environmental uncertainty by the destruction risk, we see that people in the unpredictable environment experience self-report. They find it more stressful, the game, the situation, but also they feel it more justified to capture, to steal resources of another group. The more your own private property is under risk, the more people apparently feel it justified to take someone else's property, to compensate for your own risks. So that's already interesting at the psychological level. More interesting, personally, I find what people actually do. And this we see here. So let's focus first on the top left panel A. What you see here is a black line, and that's the prediction from game theoretical, from equilibrium analysis. What you also see is in the baseline treatment, the solid red line, people overinvest in conflict significantly compared to the black line. So that's what we have seen before. So they're all good. The dotted line is the prediction from game theoretic analysis on what would happen in the uncertain environmental uncertainty. That is when there is risk of destruction. Indeed, you would expect more investment in conflict. And indeed, this is also what we see. But the overinvestment is even larger. So what we see is that the difference between the black line and the solid red line is smaller than the difference between the dotted black line and the dotted red line. When we increase environmental pressure on your private property, we see that people become exceedingly more aggressive towards other groups. We see that defenders respond in kind. And if we go to the lower part, we see that this is driven primarily by a strongly reduced tendency to free ride among attackers. They all chip in, they all help, so there's more solidarity in a way. They are also more often successful because they're so super aggressive now under unpredictable environments. Become super aggressive, they more often win from their defenders. However, if you look at panel F, what you see is that you may win, but in the end, your earnings, your individual earnings, are far lower compared to the less aggressive baseline treatment that is under no environmental unpredictability. So basically what comes out of this study is that we put people under environmental pressure that makes them more aggressive, more parochial perhaps also, less willing to free ride. They are more often victorious, but in the end they are poorer than they would have been without fighting. I see people frown. I'm happy to take a question.
Maybe just for clarification, in the unpredictable setting, they have a 40% chance that everything is gone. So of course they get less. So the right comparison would have been within this 40% loss, yeah, but no fighting.
Yeah, thank you. It's very, very good. So we find this when we do or do not correct for, we do or do not implement the gamble, so to speak. So they simply, so if you do not implement the gamble, we see that they still earn less, and this is because they waste so much more on fighting. And if you implement the gamble, this figure actually becomes even worse, so to speak. They earn even less. Right? So this is the more conservative estimate in that sense. But thanks for asking, because it's important. Yeah. Okay. Now, this is only one study, so we wanted to do another one. And this is using a slightly different setup of the attacker-defender contest. Everything is the same here, except that on both sides, each group also has a what I would call peaceful public good. So instead of putting their money into fighting capacity or into their own wallet, they can also invest their money or parts of it in a public good that has a return typical for a public good, in this particular case, a 1.5 MPCR. So for everybody to invest, 1 unit gives 1.5 unit for all 3 people in a group. Now, what could happen here is that people say, why fight? I better put my money in the public good. And then both groups would be relatively peaceful coexistence if you want, and could thrive without fighting each other. Of course, it's still attractive for the attackers to try to capture everything that the defenders generate, but it's not necessarily the case. So we might expect already less aggression than in the basic setup I talked about before. Now, what we did in this particular study is that we made the public good return predictable or certain or uncertain. Over rounds, people learned that every time the public good had an MPCR of 1.5. That was given and that was implemented as such. In another treatment, they learned that on every round, the MPCR would be between 1.2 and 1.8. So it could be super, but it could also be a bit stingy. And there was a 50% probability on each round what it would be. But prior to making their investments, they didn't know what the MPCR was. They only knew it could be 1.2 or it could be 1.8. So we have basically the expected value of the public goods are identical across rounds. It's the same. But in one case, it's very predictable, very stable. And in the other one, it fluctuates in a bit of an unpredictable, unknown way. We expected that when there is environmental unpredictability, that is the public goods MPCR is unpredictable, we would expect that it becomes more attractive for people to keep their money or perhaps invest in a tech and try to get money for their group through different, in this case, more aggressive means. And that's indeed what we see. Again, focusing only on the attackers, but we find similar patterns for defense. We see that when the MPCR is uncertain, people invest less in the public good, they invest more in a tech, and they keep slightly more for themselves. So basically, environmental unpredictability makes people both more selfish and more aggressive. You could see it that way. The result of this, over rounds aggregated, is as follows. When there is a certain MPCR, there's a predictable environment with a given return on your public goods, people actually make money. The dotted line is the starting endowment of 30, and it's not much more, but it's significant above the dotted line. So when there is a certain MPCR, people don't burn their money, they actually make a bit of money. The bulk of that earning comes from public goods provision. If we make the MPCR uncertain, we see that people invest far or earn far less from public good. And this is not because the public good returns less, it is because they invest less there and hence earn less from it. But they also do not earn more from a tech. Although they invest more in the tech, as you can see in the upper panel, they do not earn more from it. It is wasteful aggression. The reason is defenders up their defense, and hence attackers cannot win that often and just burn money on aggression. So basically what this shows is that environmental uncertainty, like in the previous study where we put the private property under risk, here we put the returns of your public goods we make them unpredictable. What we see is that it makes people more aggressive, but in the longer run, earn less, also poorer. Now, this brings me back to the starting panel that I had, where we said, can environmental pressures through carrying capacity stress induce parochialism? And I think I've shown you some evidence that indeed it does. Think about the shocking study, but also the attacker-defender studies, I think, are in line with that. And the second step we argued could be from parochialism to intergroup conflict. And also there, I think, the attacker-defender contest games have shown that indeed, when we have stronger parochialism within groups, this also translates into more aggression towards other groups. We also see that outside of parochialism, there are some selfish motives, including the expected value from the spoils of war, that directly can lead to intergroup conflict. So there are these two mechanisms, I think, that can lead environmental pressures to lead to intergroup conflict. One is selfish payoff maximization, and the other is through some solidarity mechanism within the group. And then finally, I started by arguing that intergroup conflict, and especially winning intergroup conflict, may provide you with spoils of war that actually help you to reduce the carrying capacity stress that set it all in motion. And I think the experiments that we have done clearly show that that's not the case. With environmental pressures upping parochialism, making groups even more aggressive, sometimes they therefore also win more often the conflict, but they burn so much that they can never recoup the investments in fighting. And in the end, they are left poorer than they were before, or had they not fought. Now we can summarize this as follows. Unpredictable, deteriorating environments can produce carrying capacity stress that stimulate what Bertrand Russell said, herd instincts, and tends to produce ferocity towards those who are not regarded as members of the herd. So we don't need psychology, we don't need economics, we need a solid philosopher, and there we are. Bertrand Russell knew it all. Then, when we make the risk of fighting comparatively less aversive, we see more violent attacks that are also seen as more morally justifiable. And then finally, and this is a bit of the paradox, I think, that intergroup conflict reduced individual earnings and thereby potentially increases carrying capacity stress, the very reason why people actually started, initiated, and escalated intergroup conflict. Now, these are experiments, and they were motivated by some field observations or archival studies that I started out with. And this, of course, also is about a theme that I think is important for our today's world with increasing climate change risks and wars. So the question also is, what do these data, these insights tell us for what we should do? I try to be careful here, but one thing that I find exciting and that I think could be subject of future research, also in more field settings, is that if we want to prevent or reduce conflict, I think we should target the carrying capacity stress that groups experience. If we can relax the carrying capacity stress in groups that are subject to climate change risks, for example, our findings suggest that these groups, because they do not have carrying capacity stress, may also not become aggressive towards their neighbors, and hence conflict may be mild or even absent. And this brings me back to something Keynes said when he read the Versailles Treatment. If we aim deliberately at the impoverishment of Central Europe, that is, if we aim deliberately at creating carrying capacity stress in Central Europe, vengeance, aggression, outgroup attacks, war, I dare predict, will not limp. He said this somewhere in 1922, I think, perhaps a few years thereafter. It took less than 20 years for him to be right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carsten. So we can open the floor to questions. Let me see whether there are questions from the audience. Okay, I see one raised hand. Ah, Vera, that's you. So please unmute yourself.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor de Dreu. That's all very tragic and interesting at the same time. And I was wondering whether you would have also included the psychology of scarcity findings in the experiments by Sendil Moulay-Nathan and Eldar Shafir, who have written that popular book, Scarcity. And because you mentioned, we don't need psychologists or economists, the philosopher will do. But I was also thinking how scarcity makes people less intelligent and also reduces self-control. So that would probably make everything even worse.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, so thank you very much. I agree. I think in these experiments, in this short time frame, the experimentally introduced scarcity may not necessarily make people more stupid. That should take a bit longer, I think. But it may be that they lose self-control. We haven't looked at that. Although aggressive behavior, especially so wasteful as it is in our studies, may be taken as a manifestation of reduced self-control. Could be. Now, it's important to say, and I haven't said that very clearly, in our experiment, we were very careful, except with the risk of destruction study. But in the others, we tried to be careful in making sure that there was environmental unpredictability, whereas the expected value from the environment was across time, over time at least, more or less the same. And so there is in our experiments no strict scarcity effect. The reason for that is that I think the environmental unpredictability makes it an even more conservative test of the impact of environmental pressures than deteriorating, where really things go down. So I would expect that if you create actually an increasing scarcity in the environment, the effects that we have observed here might become even stronger.
Thank you. Because natural resources are scarce in the first place too. So yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. And some scarce resources become scarcer over time. Fossil fuel, for example, wasn't that scarce 30 years ago, right? And right now it is. Yeah.
If I may ask you to clarify something related to that, I mean, it's almost a petty objection, but I think I have a bit of difficulty completely following the argument, because you are using expected value for an equivalence. And in your third study, for instance, you had an MPCR of 1.5 without uncertainty, and an MPCR of, on average, it was 1.5, but it was actually 50% probability 1.2, 50% probability of 1.8. Well, people are not risk neutral. People are typically risk averse, which means that actually those two are not equivalent for them. So those two, actually the risky one is objectively worse, according to standard preferences. Doesn't that create a confound where you cannot really say this is due to the environmental uncertainty, but it might have been just to the fact that this is objectively less attractive for people?
Okay, excellent question. Thank you. I don't think this is a confound. I think it might be, if we buy that people are on average somewhat risk averse, which I do buy, then I think this is actually part of the psychological mechanisms that are operating here. So we have objectively, it's the same, but subjectively, it may actually be not so nice, and hence we move our money elsewhere. So I see it more as part of the mechanism that is operating, that is explaining why we see what we see, than that it is a confound. Now, I must say that there is a reasonable chance that we measured risk preferences in this experiment, and in that case, we could actually examine precisely what you're suggesting. But I'm not entirely sure. The PhD student who is leading the project will defend tomorrow, and I think it would be an excellent question actually to ask him. So perhaps after tomorrow we know more about this.
Okay, thank you very much. Leo, you had a question too?
Maybe we can go first with Pitlan. He had in the Q&A.
Sure.
Peter, I think you can ask yourself if you want to.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. No, my question relates to the interpretation of this, as I put in the Q&A there, that the manipulations seem to essentially threaten payoffs, but your idea of the capacity stress is a relationship between resources and needs, but it's not clear to me in a kind of game like this what needs are. I mean, have you done anything that actually in any way operationalizes the idea of need? Because it seems to me that potentially it's different if you have a genuine relationship between capacity and need, or rather resources and need, as opposed to just a threat to payoffs, which isn't quite the same thing.
No, I think it's a good question, and this is, if you want, the only thing that I regret we have not really been able to get to. So these experiments, I think, are proxies to what carrying capacity stress could do. But I wish, and here here I blame COVID and the lockdowns that allowed us to not go into the interactive laboratories that we needed for these kind of studies, where we were able to create experimental manipulations of indeed group needs, stuff that you need to survive to make it to the end of the experimental session or to make it into the next round or something like that. I can imagine we have been discussing internally lots of ways to actually do that. And I think it would be for me an important next step to get even closer to this idea of carrying capacity stress that theoretically I think we can develop. But indeed, empirically, it would be nice to move away from these manipulations of destruction risk or public goods provision uncertainty to more this trade-off between group needs and resource supply from the environment. Yes, so it's a good point, absolutely.
Thanks.
Leo, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Carsten. Brilliant talk, super interesting. I'm wondering about the difference between deteriorating stress, deteriorating capacity and uncertainty. They could be quite different when it comes to the policy implications. So sometimes when an environmental resource is deteriorating, you cannot do much about this, to some extent. But maybe you can set up some insurance profiles to reduce the uncertainty for farmers, let's say, that if it's a bad year, then the government sets in, So for policy, these might be very different, but the way you present them, they're kind of on the same level. But have you thought about the difference here and what it means for policy making?
Yeah, I think, it's super exciting to think this through. I have no data, but my intuition, and that's partly informed by my own research, of course, is that people are more aversive to unpredictability than to deteriorating scarcity. So if you ask me, do you want to have an unpredictable income, which on the average generates the same, or predictable, but 10% less than now, I might actually go for that. Because I want it to be predictable. That's perhaps more important than being it abundant. Now, again, this may be an idiosyncratic thing, and it depends also on how much you earn. But still, I wouldn't be surprised that there would be some systematicity there. And if that's true, and I think that's important, if that's true, then indeed the policy implications are very important, because we are typically reacting on the reduced income or the reduced supply, increasing scarcity, whereas the environmental unpredictability may be a more important thing to tackle with insurances or information or stress relievers, meditation programs, I don't know. So I agree with you that disentangling these two and thinking through whether the same intervention would apply best to the unpredictability or the scarcity. And if you have to choose which of the two to target, I would say target the unpredictability more than the deterioration in and of itself. Yeah.
Okay, we have another question by Jan Engelman. Jan, you can unmute yourself. Go on.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sure.
Hello. Thanks, Carsten, for the nice talk. I just have not so much a question, but a comment on the previous question. So one way I was thinking that you might be able to increase your carrying capacity stress, is that how you call it, the CCS? Might be to ask participants to fast before the experiment. My thing is going crazy here. And then have them compete over food resources. So typically this is done in neuroeconomics and in multiple food experiments. We asked participants to fast for 4 to 6 hours before an experiment. Then they do the experiment and then they have to stay an hour afterwards where they then consume whatever they've won throughout the experiment. So that might be a way to make it more visceral and visceral and directly relate the decisions or the attacker-defender game, the payouts to, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I can see why we didn't do those studies during COVID lockdowns.
No, that's not possible. Yeah.
But in principle, this would be possible to get people to staff or not come into the lab. I mean, it's labor intense. So I want to think through alternatives that are perhaps easier, working with the economic incentives, perhaps. But it's along these lines that I think we should start thinking about carrying capacity stress indeed. Yeah.
All right. Nice talk. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I don't see other questions from the audience, so maybe there's something going through my mind. I mean, in your experiments, you always had in the end 2 groups. But if I think about, I mean, social implications and even historical implications, of course, we have a number of groups. And I'm wondering about whether you have thought about feedback effects, because if one group, because of environmental uncertainty, becomes more aggressive, that actually is an environmental risk for the next group, which might become more aggressive related to a third group, which might become more aggressive related to the first group, and you might end up in a catch-22. So have you thought about this kind of possibilities?
Yeah, I have thought about it, but we have never really pursued this in any way. I mean, in a way, what you can imagine with this kind of questions is that you actually start to build agent-based simulations, for example, where you model multi-level systems, individuals in a group, groups in a network of other groups, and let them actually play the game as we have introduced them. And with these experiments, you can even have a bit of the parameters that we typically observe, like the little overinvestments and so on and so forth. So that could be one way to think about it. We're tinkering with these multi-level games for agent-based simulations, but it's complicated to do that. Empirically, if you go into the behavioral lab, again, it's similar to what Jan is suggesting. I mean, these are labor-intense studies already, as we have them here. What you're suggesting is to complicate my life tremendously.
Sure.
So I need to think about that. I mean, it would be super to actually see that, and how indeed structured populations with networks of groups, with individuals within these groups, fighting, forming coalitions, perhaps even alliances. I mean, that's of course a dynamic that would be beautiful to simulate in the laboratory and to observe. I have a few years, so perhaps, who knows? Yes.
Thank you very much. I don't want to complicate your life in order I leave that. So are there other questions from the audience? Okay, if not, then thank you very much, Carsten. It has been a pleasure. Thank you for a very interesting talk, and thank you for everybody for being here.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you.